The first letter I got after this case was from a clinic nurse. She wrote, "Last Thursday, after the last patient left, he stayed behind and labeled every insulin pen by expiration date so nobody would lose another one." I read that sentence twice. Then I set the letter down and looked out my chamber's window for a long minute. That is the case I want to tell you about. When Daniel Mercer first came into my courtroom, nothing in his file suggested that sentence would ever be written about him. His file was hard reading: false inspection notes, phone records, bank deposits, a closure order placed on the door of a free clinic that served people who did not have many other doors left to knock on. On paper, he looked simple. Then the room filled and the case stopped being simple. I want you to subscribe before I keep going. Not because what I am about to tell you is dramatic, because it is the opposite of dramatic, and those are the stories that need the most people to hear them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Then let me continue. The file first crossed my desk on April 2nd, 2025, a Wednesday just before noon. Mercy Bridge Free Clinic had already been reopened by emergency state order. The criminal case against the county health inspector who shut it down was assigned to my court in Riverton County. The first document I read was the closure notice Daniel signed at 8:40 a.m. on March 14, 2025, for the clinic at 214 East Calder Street. The second was the state audit proving the violations listed on that notice were not there. Daniel Mercer was 41. When he walked in for arraignment, the first thing I noticed was the pale line around his ring finger where a band used to sit. He had shaved carefully, but he looked tired clear through the skin. Before he sat down, he pulled a chair away from the rail so his mother could take the aisle without bumping her cane. Then he sat, placed both hands flat on the defense table, and kept them there as if movement itself might make things worse. I noticed that. I introduced Dr. Elena Marquez to myself in a different way. She was 52, the physician who ran Mercy Bridge, and she came to court in dark blue scrubs under a gray cardigan because she had seen patients that morning before driving across town. She carried a banker's box of records in one hand and a small red medication cooler in the other. She set the cooler down first, not the box, the medicine first. Later, when the prosecutor asked what outcome she wanted, she said, "I need him stopped from doing this again. I do not need him destroyed." I wrote that down too. What happened at the clinic became plain once everyone had testified. At 8:40 a.m. on Friday, March 14, 2025, Daniel Mercer arrived at Mercy Bridge with an emergency closure placard and a false inspection report. He claimed the vaccine refrigerator was unsafe, the sharps containers were overfilled, and sterile dressings had been stored in contamination risk. None of that was true. Patients were already waiting. He posted the order on the door anyway and told the clinic manager, Tasha Bell, "You can send them to North Valley, they'll be fine." North Valley Urgent Care was a private clinic 12 blocks away. Its owner, Gerald Pike, had been texting Daniel for weeks. Those messages were entered into evidence. In one, Mr. Pike said, "If Mercy Bridge goes dark, my phones light up." In another, Daniel said, "Give me 48 hours. Bank records showed Daniel had taken $2,800 from Mr. Pike under the label consulting. Mercy Bridge lost 3 days of care. A prenatal patient had to ride 27 miles for blood pressure monitoring. A diabetic man missed a wound check and ended up in an emergency room on Sunday night. Subscribe before I go further. Cases like this one do not happen as often as they should, and they deserve to be documented and heard the same way the harder ones do. Subscribe so you are here when I get to the part that made me remember why I chose this work. People often think the legal process begins when someone takes the oath. It begins earlier than that. It begins in the quiet choices a judge makes about what kind of tools to use and what kind of room the court will be. In this case, I ordered a full presentence investigation and, before sentencing, a separate community impact hearing. That sounds technical. It is not. It is the part where I get to ask not only what was broken, but whether there is a real way to make the person who broke it help repair it. In plain language, discretion meant this. The law gave me a range of punishment, but it also gave me room to decide where inside that range justice actually lived. A strict reading of the file could have produced a short, clean answer: convict him, jail him, close the folder. But discretion allowed me to consider what he did after he was caught, what the clinic actually needed, and whether there was a sentence that could punish the abuse of trust without wasting the man standing in front of me. From the bench, I watch people enter before I hear a single word. Daniel came in slower on the first day of trial than he had at arraignment. He carried a yellow legal pad under his arm and kept touching the top page with his thumb, as if he was making sure it was still there. He did not look at me first. He looked toward the gallery. That is where his mother sat, along with 2 county employees who had once worked beside him and now left a full seat open between themselves and his family. I noticed that too. Dr. Marquez came in through the side door used by witnesses, though she did not have to. From where I sat, I saw her stop just inside the rail and rest her hand for 1 second on the shoulder of one of her nurses before she sat down. The nurse nodded. No words. The kind of gesture people do when they have already carried too much together and do not need to explain the rest. On that day, the room told me, before the testimony ever did, that this case was not only about anger, it was about burden. Turn 1 came from a witness who was nearly treated like background. Her name was Lila Rowan, the clinic receptionist. She had been checking patients in when Daniel arrived with the closure notice. She described the confusion in the waiting room, the phones ringing, the questions nobody could answer. Then she said an older patient named Samuel Holloway began to panic because his backup oxygen tank refill was in a cabinet behind the line Daniel had taped off. Daniel looked at the man, looked at the tape, and broke his own seal so the nurse could get the refill. That act did not erase the crime. It did not make the false report less false, but it forced me to read the rest of the case more carefully. Then Lila Rowan said the sentence that changed it for me. She said, he did the wrong thing, Judge, but he was not trying to watch people suffer. That was turn 1. Not the moment the law changed, the moment the person did. From then on, I was not reading a villain in a file. I was reading a man who had done a very real wrong and had not become empty inside when he did it. The state's evidence stayed hard. Refrigerator logs showed stable temperatures from 36 to 38 degrees. Security video showed Daniel never tested the unit before writing it up. The photograph attached to his report had metadata from 2023, not 2025. His bank deposits matched Gerald Pike's withdrawals. When state investigators interviewed him, Daniel admitted he knew North Valley would benefit if Mercy Bridge closed. The facts proved the charges. My growing care in how I saw him did not weaken a single one of them. I'm still thinking about what this case taught me. Subscribe, because before this video ends, I'm going to try to say it out loud, and I want you to be here when I do. Subscribe now. Daniel testified on the second afternoon. Defendants often begin by trying to sound safer than they really are. He did too. His first answers were tight and overworked. Then his lawyer stopped steering him toward the least damaging version of himself, and his voice changed. When asked why he first answered Gerald Pike's messages, Daniel said, "My mother's dialysis clinic changed, and I was already 3 months behind before I took $1." That explained pressure. It did not excuse corruption. Still, it told me something true about the life he had been too proud to describe earlier. Later, on cross-examination, the prosecutor asked him whether he knew the inspection report was false when he signed it. He did not hide there. He said, "I knew those refrigerator numbers were false when I wrote them." That mattered to me. Real accountability usually sounds less polished than self-protection. It is rarely pretty. It is often brief. Then, when asked whether he had thought about the patients at all when he posted the order, he said, "I told myself it was only 3 days. I was lying to myself before I was lying to anyone else." That sentence did not help him legally. It helped me understand the shape of his failure. After I found him guilty of bribery, falsifying public records, and official misconduct, I did something I was glad the rules allowed me to do. I set sentencing out for 6 weeks and ordered the community impact hearing I mentioned earlier. During that gap, Dr. Marquez did something I did not expect. Over the objection of one clinic board member and the surprise of the prosecutor, she agreed to let Daniel perform supervised non-clinical work at Mercy Bridge while he waited for sentencing, not because she trusted him, because, as she said, if he is going to answer for this, he should answer where the harm still lives. That hearing produced turn two. Daniel's lawyer entered a black composition notebook into evidence. The spine was cracked, the cover bent, and the pages inside were full of handwritten entries over 11 weeks, supply counts, refrigerator temperatures recorded 3 times a day, patient transport logs with initials only, lists of expired items removed from shelves, notes about relabeling bins in English and Spanish. It was not written for me. That was the point. It was work made visible by habit. Paula Vance, a retired nurse who supervised volunteers, testified that Daniel had completed 187 hours at Mercy Bridge without missing a shift. Then she said, "He asks where the need is, not where he will be seen." I looked toward Dr. Marquez when she said it. She had taken off her glasses and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose. She was not looking at Daniel. She was looking at the notebook. That was turn 2. The evidence did not ask me to feel sorry for him. It showed me something concrete about what he could become if the sentence I designed required the right things. Subscribe before I continue. I have been building to something in this story, and it is not where you might think it is going. Subscribe and let me get there. The defense helped itself by being honest. Daniel's lawyer, Maria Chen, did not ask me to rename what he had done. She said, "My client did not stumble. He chose money, then convenience, then rank. I am not asking the court to pretend otherwise. I am asking the court to sentence the whole man, and not only the ugliest month of his life. Lawyers do not always say the truest thing available. When they do, I listen. What the defense got wrong was the scale of public harm. This was not just one false form. Daniel used the county's authority to steer poor patients away from free care and toward a private rival. He signed the state's name to a private bargain. That reaches farther than one shut door. It tells people with the fewest options that the system can be rented. I was not going to sentence this as if it were merely sloppy paperwork. Then Maria Chen asked Daniel one last question. She asked what he would do if Mercy Bridge kept letting him work there after sentencing. Daniel looked down first, then he looked at me and said, "If they let me in the back door, I will keep showing up until I am more help than harm." That was the moment I knew what I was going to do. I wrote it down. Not because I needed to remember it, because I wanted to. There was a memory from my own life sitting quietly beside this case by then. I had not thought about it in years. I was 12, standing in a free clinic hallway with my mother and my younger brother Eli, who was wheezing so hard he could not finish a sentence. The waiting room was full. A volunteer nurse with a coffee stain on her left sleeve brought my mother a folding chair and brought my brother a paper cup of water. Then she went into a back room and came out with a sample inhaler and a look on her face that said the door had held for one more family. I had not thought about that hallway in a long time. Subscribe. I am not going to make a speech about it. You are already in this story. Subscribe and let me finish. Sentencing was set for July 28, 2025 at 9:30 a.m. By then, I had read the presentence report twice. Probation had verified his finances, his mother's medical expenses, his counseling intake, his work history, and every hour he had served at the clinic. They had also verified Mercy Bridge's losses, $18,640 in spoiled medication, emergency reinspection fees, replacement supplies, generator rental, and rescheduling costs. A judge should know what every dollar means before ordering it paid. I also read Dr. Marquez's final victim statement. She said, "I do not want him back in authority. I do want him where he has to look at what authority did." That narrowed the whole problem for me in exactly the right way. Prison would punish him. It would not necessarily confront him with the real shape of the damage. The law gave me room to do more than one thing at once if I was willing to be precise. Before I spoke, I looked at the room. Daniel had both hands around a paper cup of water and had not taken a drink. Dr. Marquez sat upright with her arms resting loosely, not tightly, across her middle. In the second row, Daniel's mother had folded her church bulletin into a square no bigger than her palm. Nobody was whispering. Nobody was leaning back. The room had that specific kind of attention people bring when they are waiting to learn whether anything decent is still possible. Subscribe. I have not told you the full sentence yet. I am about to. Subscribe before I do, because I want to explain every part of it, and the explanation is as important as the ruling itself. Subscribe now. I had made this decision carefully. I had made it knowing that mercy, to mean anything, has to be precise. Vague mercy is just hope. Precise mercy is a plan. I had a plan. I sentenced Daniel Mercer on the custody portion of the offense range to 24 months, and then I suspended that term. I placed him on 36 months of supervised probation. I also ordered 60 days of county work release beginning that Friday at 6 p.m. I did that because public trust had been abused, and a sentence with no immediate weight would have said the wrong thing. But I suspended the larger term because I needed him employed, watched, and available to repair what he had damaged. I ordered him to pay $18,640 in restitution directly to Mercy Bridge Free Clinic. I also imposed a $12,500 fine to the Riverton Patient Access Fund. I explained it in plain language. Money was part of how he got into this, so money had to be part of how he answered for it, not because dollars undo fear, they do not, but because clinics stay open or close on actual bills, and a sentence that ignores that is only pretending to be complete. I ordered 900 hours of restorative service over 18 months. At least 450 of those hours had to be completed at Mercy Bridge if Dr. Marquez continued to allow it. The rest had to be served with county-approved patient transport and mobile care programs for uninsured residents. I told him he would stock, clean, carry, file, drive, and wait. He would not supervise. He would not inspect. He would not stand over anyone with a clipboard. He had used authority to close a door. I was requiring labor that helped hold doors open. I ordered him to surrender his health inspector license for 5 years. I ordered 24 weeks of ethics counseling and financial decision-making classes because the evidence showed his corruption grew where pride and pressure met. I required full-time lawful employment, monthly proof of income, and 2 community college courses, one in public health administration and one in nonprofit governance, both to be passed with at least a C. I do not add conditions to sound stern. I add them to close the gaps the evidence reveals. And there was one more thing. I ordered Daniel to attend the first Tuesday patient advisory meeting at Mercy Bridge and the third Thursday County Care Access Board meeting every month for 1 year. For the first 6 meetings, he was not allowed to speak unless someone addressed him directly. After that, he had to answer any question put to him truthfully and without argument. Public trust was part of what he misused. Public listening was part of what I required in return. I gave him one condition for early completion. If by month 18 he had paid every dollar of restitution, completed at least 700 service hours, finished counseling and classes, and received written confirmation from the clinic volunteer coordinator that he had completed 100 patient transport shifts on time and without complaint, I would consider ending the final 12 months of probation. That was my way of leaving room for proof. Courts should not hand out belief lightly. But when belief is tied to work, it can become part of the sentence itself. Then I spoke to him directly. I said, "You closed a clinic that did not belong to you to close. You sent poor patients into longer drives, longer waits, and worse fear because you wanted a rival business to benefit and because you decided your pressure mattered more than their access." I said, "The people harmed by this were not abstract. They were diabetics, parents, elders, and workers who needed the place you treated like a bargaining chip." Then I said, "The charges describe what you did. They do not contain everything you are." And because I meant it, I added, "Mr. Mercer, I believe you can do this." I ended with, "The next time a door depends on you, Daniel, open it." Thank you for staying with this story. It is not the kind of story people usually tell about courtrooms. Subscribe if it is the kind of story you want more of. I have more to tell. What happened next, while I was still on the bench, is one of the reasons I remember this case as clearly as I do. People had started to rise. Papers were being gathered. Chairs were shifting. Dr. Marquez crossed the well of the courtroom before the deputy could ask anyone to clear. She stopped at the defense table and said, "Monday, 7:30. Wear shoes you can clean in." Daniel nodded once and said, "Yes, ma'am." That was all. Before I stood, I put the cap back on my pen and squared the corners of the sentencing order against the wood. I do that every day. On that day it felt different. Small things can feel different when a room has chosen work over waste. The one specific thing I later learned came on November 18, 2026, in the letter I mentioned at the start. The nurse wrote about Thursday, November 13th, the last patient had left. The front lights were off. Daniel stayed behind in the medication room and labeled every donated insulin pen by expiration date in English and Spanish so no one would lose another box to confusion or haste. She added, "He shows up early and he does the work nobody thanks you for." I believed her. No appeal was filed. That mattered to me more than I expected. It meant he accepted the sentence as something to live under, not something to talk around. Courts issue orders every day. Acceptance is rarer. I noticed it. What I came to believe because of this case is simple. Mercy is not the opposite of accountability. Sloppy mercy is. It would have been easier to give a speech about public corruption, impose a term, and move the file to the closed stack. It would also have been easier, in a different way, to be sentimental and call volunteer work a substitute for what he had done. I did neither. The hard part was building a sentence tight enough to hold the harm and open enough to allow repair. I have seen defendants ask for leniency when what they really wanted was distance from consequence. I have seen victims ask for the maximum because what they needed most was to hear the injury measured correctly. This case asked more of everyone. It asked Dr. Marquez to be clear. It asked Daniel to stop managing his image and start carrying weight. It asked me to trust a structure I was willing to enforce. What it gave back to me, not as a judge, but as a person, was a little more faith and careful seeing. If you have been where Daniel was, I will tell you one thing I look for from the bench. I look for the moment a person stops arguing with the facts and starts accepting the cost of them. Not polished regret, not panic, steady truth and useful effort. If that is you, do not spend your energy trying to sound better than what you did. Start becoming more useful than the harm you caused. Courts can tell the difference. And if you have been where Dr. Marquez was, asked whether mercy for someone who hurt you might belong in the right outcome, I am not going to tell you what you should want. That is yours. I can only tell you what I have witnessed. When victims choose a precise form of mercy, and when they do it from clarity rather than pressure, it often seems to return something to them that pure punishment does not always return. Not ease, not certainty, but a steadier hand on what comes next. So I returned to the sentence from that nurse's letter. After the last patient left, he stayed behind and labeled every insulin pen by expiration date so nobody would lose another one. That is why I told you this story. If you want to hear the others, and there are others, subscribe. That is all I am asking. Subscribe and stay. And if you leave something in the comments, leave it the way people speak in a room where justice and humanity are not opposites.